The land was everything. Page 1. Rural life, once and future. The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. He must, therefore, entertain new ideas and form new opinions. From involuntary idleness, servile dependence, penury, and useless labor, he has passed to toils of a very different nature, rewarded by ample subsistence. This is an American. Move around a little. Okay, that is from J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. One. Farmers see things as others do not. Their age-old knowledge is more than the practical experience that comes from the art of growing food or from the independence of rural living. It involves a radically different, often tragic, view of human nature itself that slowly grows through the difficult struggle to work and survive from the land, destroyed by hail that most others ignore, praying for a rain that few will notice, increasingly foreclosed upon in a sea of cash, smug in their ability to nourish thousands, but bewildered that they cannot feed their family, apart from town, but dependent on those who are not, still confused over how and why plants usually produce harvests, but sometimes do not. The last generation of American farmers have become foreign to their countrymen, who were once as they. In these letters, I wish to pass on some of that social and civic wisdom that I have learned from those now mostly dead or bankrupt. Not because their insight necessarily has any archival or antiquarian importance, but because the farmer's understanding of man and society in our present age is absolutely critical to the survival of democracy as we once knew it. Democracy at its inceptions, ancient and American, has always been the outgrowth of an agrarian society, but its old bones now have new and different flesh. Consensual government can continue in the vastly transformed conditions of great wealth, urbanism, and rapidly changing technology never foreseen by its originators. But whether democracy can still instill virtue among its citizens will be answered by the age that is upon us, which for the first time in the history of civilization will at last see a democracy without farmers. Really? I claim no originality in the idea of writing letters about the farmer's lessons to those who do not farm. Over 200 years ago, J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur published a collection of 12 essays on American culture and rural life under the title Letters from an American Farmer, 1782. Crevecoeur's letters are generally regarded as the beginning of American literature, inasmuch as they are the first formal expressions of what it was to be American. The opening to homesteaders of new frontier lands across the eastern seaboard, the immigration and assimilation of a wide variety of Europeans, and the turmoil of the American Revolution convinced Crevecoeur that he was witnessing, at the end of the 18th century, the birth of a unique nation and a singular man. In his view, freeholding yeomanry lay at the heart of this great experiment in creating a middling, rambunctious, democratic citizenry that could not be fooled, enticed, or enslaved. A society quite different even from the emerging consensual governments in contemporary Europe, which had neither the land nor the freedom to work it that we enjoyed. In America, the European... Here's an excerpt from Crevecoeur um, Crevecoeur's letters. In America, the European. Now starts the excerpt. Now feels himself a man because he is treated as such. The laws of his own country had overlooked him in his insignificancy. The laws of this cover him with their mantle. Judge what an alteration there must arise in the mind and the thoughts of this man. He begins to forget his former servitude and dependence. His heart involuntarily swells and grows. This first swell inspires him with those new thoughts which constitute an American. What love can he entertain for a country where his existence was a burden to him? If he is a generous, good man, the love of his new adoptive parent will sink deep into his heart. There's 2 moths attracted to my book light. Part formal essays, part autobiographical memoirs, part fictive sketches on everything from the island of Nantucket to slavery to the American hummingbird. The letters of Crevecoeur are rambling, confused, and at times almost unreadable, but they do use brilliantly the landscape of contemporary 18th century agriculture to demonstrate how the natural bounty of America and the availability of vast expanses of farmland molded the European religious and political heritage into something far more dynamic, something never before seen or even imagined. Crevecoeur was a materialist. Where people live, what they do, how they work, determines how they think and who they are. He believed that the farmland of North America was everything, and its rich abundance critical to fashioning a new culture. Crevecoeur's American Man, then, is purportedly novel, and he is surely different from any in Europe, because he has room and resources to be freely exploited. The American is wholly an untraditional creature whose successful existence has proved that free and insignificant men fleeing Europe can create a novel culture from an unforgiving nature as the formerly despised... Calm down, trees! As the formerly despised become culture's guardians on the frontier. This new man is, of course, a curmudgeon who would be very hard to deprive of his newfound liberty, who would only with difficulty be coerced or uprooted, and he would not be fooled by the trend and jargon of town. He is as rough and unromantic among his urban peers as he is in his mute fields. In other words, a hard-nosed, no-nonsense American. So Crevecoeur wrote his Letters from an American Farmer in the belief that the emergence of human and free landowners in America meant the genesis of a new egalitarian American culture. Muscular labor, now autonomous and in service of the individual, would create a self-confident, viable, and pragmatic novel citizen in place of the passive serf and ignorant day laborer of past inegalitarian regimes of the European monarchies. Yet his new farmer citizen was to be at odds also with the trader and near savage who leaves nothing in his wake, who was made brutish by North America's wild rather than taming it. Crevecoeur's American agriculturalists alone, who had created cultural order out of natural chaos, homesteads, cultivated fields, bridges, small towns, had hit upon that rare middle ground, freeholding human, neither rich nor poor, wild nor pampered, brutes nor sophisticates, day laborers nor absentee lords. A American Democrats were not to be coffeehouse intellectuals, nor a volatile mob, eager for someone else's property. Fix the phone for my slouching. Crevecoeur's powers of abstract observation and analysis derived from his own unique background. He was classically trained at a Jesuit college in France. Latin remains untranslated frequently in the text. He traveled widely, holding a variety of jobs, and for at least 7 years he was married and raised 3 children on his farm, until the tumult of the Revolutionary War forced him to flee America. Crevecoeur farmed for less than a decade before his return to Europe, where he entered diplomatic service and became a literary figure in his own right in revolutionary France. His letters were intended to put the experience of agrarianism in a wider historical context to a mostly literary and urban European audience, confused over and fascinated with democratic revolution in their midst. Though he was a genuine farmer for almost a decade, agriculture was but a parenthesis in his life, which was ironically spent largely in Europe writing about farming in America. His letters, then, as generations of critics have pointed out, suffer from the paradox of an ex-farmer writing about what he will not or cannot any longer do. As a farmer turned professor as well, I can empathize. Still, Crevecoeur's letters were an immediate success among contemporaries for 2 reasons. The largely European audience was curious about the creation of this new social paradigm in America, and they wanted to know the natural esoterica of a frontier and rural lifestyle, pretty much unknown in Europe. The ostensibly fictional account is actually a first-hand look at life in rural New England and details the creation and management of a working farm. To European contemporaries, its collection of Indians, slaves, war, pestilence, and near starvation on the frontier reads like a traveler's fantasy of a far-off savage paradise. Indeed, antiquarians today often mine the letters for the preservation of first-hand data on the everyday life of an America in creation. But again, the book's real interest, past and present, arose from its literary exploration of a more important topic. What is an American, and was he really so new? What is the relationship between the cultivated landscape of America and the nature of its citizenry? What has American... I thought I was going to say America. What has American agrarianism done to improve upon the Western paradigm as practiced in Europe? And could the muscular and uncouth govern themselves without the guardianship of the academic and refined? Over 2 centuries later. Beautiful lights. Berry bliss. Of the academic and refined. Over 2 centuries later, I think our citizens know less about American independent farming than did Crevecoeur's Europeans 200 years ago. He tells us what he really thinks. This is a great tragedy, perhaps the tragedy of the last half-century. They have completely forgotten the original relationship between farming and democracy, which he sought so carefully to explain. As a consequence, I suspect few Americans can define in the abstract what they were or who they are. Few of us work with our hands or become dirty from the soil. Unless we're puttering in our gardens, those who do so for work more often wish that they did not. The labor of muscle, unless directed to the narcissistic obsession with the healthy body, is deemed. Do you think he's talking about California? Just kidding. Is deemed unfortunate, whereas the work of the tongue is alone prized. That the two might be combined and thus become greater than either is ignored or forgotten. To Crevecoeur, the dichotomy of the effete, it's spelled E-F-F-E-T-E, intellectual, and the brutish, okay. To Crevecoeur, the dichotomy of the effete, intellectual, and the brutish thug, so common in Europe, is solved by the emergence of the independent American farmer who avoided through his autonomy, craft, and labor the pitfalls of both. I agree. To walk into a room of farmers is to see some of the most rough-looking yet highly intelligent citizens in America. 2 centuries later, I have returned to Crevecoeur's approach to update and conclude his thesis, just as he held that the formation of freeholding Yemen created the American Republican spirit. So now the decline of family farming in our own generation is symptomatic of the demise of his notion of what an American was, just as Crevecoeur saw unlimited land, small towns, multi-ethnicism, the growth of a middle class, self-reliance, and a common culture as essential to the creation of Americanism and its democracy. I am afraid that I see that the decline of family farming, the end of the egalitarian principle of farm ownership, the growth of urbanism, the assurance of entitlement, and the disappearance of a rural middle class ensure the demise of Crevecoeur's American. Jeez. Oh, Victor Hansen. Check out what happens in 20 years. This was written in 2000, published in 2000, by the way. Just as Crevecoeur worried about the landless serf, who was volatile and thus dangerous, so I worry about the middle class American of the present consumer society, who has become a transient servant of his appetites. Transient. The crowd in Walmart and at home before Oprah, and the very few who profit from it all, can be more alike than they think. As in Mr. Crevecoeur's era, we are now once more creating a new American, and he is not merely different, not merely a product of changed times and circumstances. We have lost our agrarian landscape, and with it the assurance that there would be an autonomous, outspoken, and critical group of citizens eager to remind the rest of us of the current fads and follies of the day. Crevecoeur was not naive, and not a romantic entirely. Freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy were possible because man in America had little leisure, less affluence, and found success or failure largely in his own efforts. Surfeit for the human species was as great a danger as poverty. Sloth the more terrible peril than exhaustion. Education and contemplation without action, the near religious faith of today's intellectual class, meant not impotence, but moral vacuity itself. It was not merely democracy that was important, but the type of people who created democracy. Okay. To Crèvecoeur, like Aristotle before, man was tame, only to the degree he was occupied. That's funny. It's funny. Man was tame only to the degree he was occupied, independent only as long as he owned property. Only through agriculture was the citizen in constant observation of how terrible loomed the animal and human world about him. Man realizes the dangers of his own natural savagery. His own natural savagery, only through his attempt at physical mastery of the world about him. I think I've got allergy brain. World about him. Many men and women who undergo this experience provide a check on those who do not. Such farmers question authority and yet follow the law. They are suspicious of the faddishly non-traditional, yet remain highly eccentric themselves. They vote and work for civic projects and group cohesion, and yet they tend to be happiest when left alone. These who historically have been democracy's greatest supporters, by not quite being convinced of the ultimate wisdom of democracy. In contrast, Crèvecoeur's trappers and traders who live as natural men on the edge of the frontier are not romantic individualists, but more often beasts, without permanent residence, without responsibilities to others, without desire to clean and separate themselves from the foul world they must inhabit and have surrendered to. They and the refined urban merchant both dwell, then, in antithesis to the farmer, who both conquers and lives with nature, who practices both a solitary and a communal existence, who is and is not one with the government at large. From that personal, strife-filled experience of working the soil, the yeoman citizen alone transfers his code of stewardship, reasoned exploitation, and independence to the wider society of his peers, this muscled reader of books, this hardened lover of beauty. That the balance and stability of agrarianism in itself explains the health of a culture now seems to us, of the post-industrial age, preposterous. But to Crèvecoeur, that connection was self-evident to the point of being unquestioned.